Well, greetings, everyone, and welcome to another installment of City Lights Live, the online iteration of the City Lights events calendar. I am your host, Peter Maravellis. As always, we are beaming to you from the unceded ancestral homeland of the Ramaytush Ohlone peoples, also known as the San Francisco Bay Area. It is always an honor and a privilege to do so. So, for today's program, we welcome back to the house Daniel Rachel, celebrating a new book release. We had the great pleasure of hosting him last year for his previous book, Too Much Too Young, the two-tone record story. We had an awesome event over at the Makeout Room in San Francisco, complete with DJs, spinning vinyl. So it was a lot of fun. Daniel is back with another compelling read. It is called This Ain't Rock and Roll, Pop Music, the Swastika, and the Third Reich. It features an introduction by Billy Bragg, and it is published by the fabulous Akashic Books. And it explores the motivations and psychology of why some of rock and roll's most celebrated musicians have flirted with the imagery and theatrics of the Third Reich. Swastikas, iron crosses, the SS Death's Head emblems have all been brandished by a wide array of musicians from Sid Vicious to Siouxsie Sioux, Keith Moon to Vivian Stanshall, associating themselves in very troubling ways with the aesthetics and the ideology of Nazism. So This Ain't Rock and Roll places a critical magnifying glass upon why so much have been drawn to the imagery of a movement responsible for the 20th century's worst atrocities. It asks the essential questions and reassesses the history of rock and roll, shedding new light on the grim echoes of the Third Reich in popular culture and the legacy of 20th and 21st century history as it defines us today. Daniel Rachel is a Birmingham-born best-selling author whose previous works include, as I mentioned, Too Much Too Young, also Oasis, Knebworth, Two Nights That Will Live Forever, and The Lost Album of the Beatles. He is also co-author of Ranking Rogers' autobiography, I Just Can't Stop It, My Life in the Beat. And in 2021, Daniel was the guest curator of Two Tone Lives and Legacies, the exhibition in Coventry. And he curated the anniversary edition of Selector's debut album, Too Much Pressure. He makes his home in London. And joining him in conversation today will be Johnny Temple, the publisher of Akashic Books and a gifted musician in his own right. Of course, Akashic Books is one of the premier indie presses in the US, and it's always an honor to host their authors and have them in the house. So we're going to be posting links in the chat function of your Zoom dashboard with which you may purchase books. We'll also be making time for a Q&A at the end of the talk, so you may also post your questions in that same chat function. So join us in offering a warm welcome to Daniel Rachel and conversation with Johnny Temple. It is a pleasure to have you both with us. Welcome to City Lights.
Great. Thank you so much, Peter. Hello, everybody. I'm Johnny Temple, as Peter just said. And I wanted to start by thanking City Lights and Peter for hosting this program. City Lights, as most of you probably know, is one of the truly great bookstores the world over. And they are also a fantastic book publishing company. And Akashic Books is always thrilled to be collaborating in any way, shape, or form with City Lights. They are definitely comrades of ours. In the struggle to make this troubled world a better place through literature and culture. And I'm also deeply honored to be the publisher of this brand new book by Daniel Rachel. Here's the really handsome book cover. And also the publisher of his previous book, Too Much Too Young, the two-tone record story. Daniel is just a fantastic writer, journalist, and we love working with him. So to kick off this conversation, Daniel, you discuss this a bit in the epilogue of the book, but can you talk a little bit about what your initial inspiration was in writing this book?
Yeah. Good evening, everybody. I don't know if it's evening for you, but it is in London. The inspiration, it goes back to childhood, and I was a Sex Pistols fan, and I would happily sing along to Belson Was a Gas, and I had the Great Rock and Roll Swindle, the book, and then the film, and within that is Sid Vicious wearing a swastika t-shirt, And I've got the picture of myself has come up in front of me. It's really disconcerting because it looks like I'm talking to myself, and I don't know how to get rid of that. So I'm just trying to do that. Sorry, it was yeah. So, but I saw the humour in the Sex Pistols and in Sid Vicious, but at exactly the same time, my mother came home with a VHS cassette, and was on the spine was printed the word Holocaust, and she placed it very high up on a bookshelf and said, "You can watch this, but we have to watch it together because of the content, what the content is." And that's all she said. And of course, the first time they went off shopping on a Saturday afternoon, I kind of clambered up the bookshelf, grabbed the VHS, put it into the machine. And for the next hour, I saw black and white footage of the liberation of the camps across occupied Europe. And I think those images are stamped at the forefront of my mind from being a young kid and ever since. And the juxtaposition and contradiction of the pistols and music here and history and death camps there, I think has confused me ever since. And that feels like ultimately that's the genesis of what this book is, to make sense of my young confusion and bring that into a narrative that's worthy of a book you might publish.
And was that the first time your Sex Pistols experience, was that the first time that you had encountered Nazi imagery in popular culture? Or was it the first time that you noticed it that had an effect on you?
Well, it's definitely when it had an effect on me. I mean, I must have, because all the way through the 70s in England, they were showing imagery on comedy programs, Saturday night evening entertainment programs, films, imagery of the Third Reich, of swastikas. You could see things on top of the pops occasionally, like when the Sweet appeared on top of the pops and somebody's wearing a Nazi brassard. And it was even in Fawlty Towers with John Cleese. Whether I saw that or not, I don't know, but I suspect those kind of things were subconsciously filtering in to myself. But I don't know if I would have been aware of it until the Pistols. That's my first memory. Actually, you're the first person to ask me that, so I don't know. Maybe something will trigger as we're talking.
Yeah. So, do you see punk rock and rock music in general as an arena where so-called straight society's rules are either relaxed or ignored? And is that something that appeals to you about sort of musical culture and music in general?
I mean, I was in a band and all my life, from being a teenager to when I wrote my first book, which was published in 2013, and that was my life. And as you are a musician too, and the part of being in bands and being a musician is it feels like stepping away from the real world. You can be something different, not have a recognized job or proper job, as we call it here. And there's it's a license to be stupid. It's a license to be anti the mainstream. It's rock and roll has a license for many, many things. And then if you become a signed band and successful, that just amplifies beyond measure. And I think that we can read that into the history of rock and roll, punk included, from its inception to today. And the result of that is rock and roll, to a degree, is unaccountable to wider society. And that can mean, in this instance, what we're talking about, use of the swastika, use of Third Reich imagery, but it can also mean that is misogynistic, it can be sexist, it can be racist according to the color of somebody's skin, it can be offensive. It's many, many things. And those historically have, to greater and lesser degrees, have been allowed. And again, in some of those areas, it's shutting down. I mean, you only have to look at, since the death of George Floyd and since the Me Too movement, I would make an argument that rock and roll has begun to challenge itself of its past and say, our past is not acceptable and we will try and change. More so with racism, less so with misogyny, to a degree sexism, and virtually nothing, and a little bit with sexism, with the swastika. But the great example of that, I think, is Mick Jagger and Brown Sugar. And that a few years ago, of his own accord, Jagger said, the Stones will no longer perform Brown Sugar. Now that's quite a thing, because it's one of Keith Richards' greatest riffs, one of their greatest songs. But as he argued, the Stones were one thing in the late 60s, early 70s, and Mick Jagger says, we're not that now, and I don't feel comfortable singing about a black woman going into slavery and whatever else he feels that song is about in the lyricism. And that's quite an incredible thing to do. And if the Stones can make that kind of a statement and reflect on their past, I think that opens a door to what ultimately this book is talking about.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is just an interesting, and I don't want to stay on it too long because I want to get into the heart of what the book is. But one of the questions that your book raises, but also that the contemporary society, post murder of George Floyd society, etc., a society informed by Me Too, is that part of the appeal of popular music, but especially rock and roll music and punk music, is what you referred to as like the license to be stupid or the license to be clever. And I think that, and so, people don't necessarily want their musical heroes to always behave. And yet you do not want your musical heroes, many of us, most of us, I hope, don't want our musical heroes wearing swastikas either. But I do think it raises some interesting questions about, the role of the artist, because it comes back to a sort of traditional First Amendment. If you're going to make freedom of speech, if you're going to make speech free, it can't be free for just beauty. It also has to be.
It's true, but I think in the modern climate, I can't imagine that rock and roll would accept somebody showing a T-shirt of a lynching, say, in the South,
Yes.
of a black man, black woman. And I don't think it would be acceptable to show images of a rape or sexual violence. And I think that's where rock and roll has moved forward. But at the same time, what you're saying, I think I agree with, and I like the idea that there's a you can swing from intelligence to stupidity, absolutely. But what was my train of thought there? That we want to think the best of our heroes, and in many ways they can behave and live out lives on our behalf, and we buy into them and want them to push extremes. And but in these instances, I've had several months now of the UK publication of this book ahead of the US and the reaction here, and then obviously in all conversations leading up to that. And that's what people want to excuse David Bowie, they want to excuse Lemmy, they want to excuse John Lennon or Lady Gaga or Madonna or even Kanye West, because they support those artists. So what they do is they offer and the reasons why they behave in such a way. But when I wrote this book, what I decided to do was that I wouldn't speak on behalf of anybody. I would allow the artist to speak and the journalist to speak historically. So in any one of those incidents, I would see what did they say? What can I find in print? What were they asked by media, in interviews, wherever? What did managers say? What did the record company say? And not make any assumption. And I think in most cases, try not to make a judgment, just to say, look, here it is. This is what it is. And often that was very, very different to what people were telling me. This is why Bowie does it. This is why blah does it. This is why she does it, or they do it. And that's really important, I think, to root it in fact, not conjecture.
I think that that's one of the truly brilliant aspects of your book, is that you allow the artists to share their perspective. And like I said a couple minutes earlier, you keep your editorializing, your own personal editorializing. It's not silent, but it is, you do, it feels restrained. I also will take this moment to point out that, as it says on the book cover, there's an introduction by Billy Bragg, which is phenomenal. And in a sense, he doesn't have to exercise necessarily the same restraint as you, the author, have chosen to exercise. And there's a just a lovely clarity to Billy Bragg's short introduction. For those of you who buy the book, this book is gonna move you, and it's nice to be sort of introduced by Billy Bragg in this way.
I wrote to Billy and I said, here's some reasons why I think you're the person to write the introduction. I wrote one reason, another said a third, fifth, six, seven reasons, and he ignored every single one of them. Entirely different. But going back to the very first thing that you brought up, he's the contemporary reason in many why the book happened. In as much as over the years I've got to know Billy, and he always argues that rock and roll can't change the world. That favorite question of so many people. And right. He's got 4 decades of experience. He's a man that knows. But I would always argue with him, saying, no, you're wrong. Because you just don't want to take responsibility for you. You want to put it on the audience. But then I began to think about that as an idea. And I thought, well, when has music really changed something? And that got me thinking about musicians in Nazi camps. And that's what I began to write about, because I thought that if you played an instrument, an accordion, a violin, a guitar, a clarinet, that would save your life, because you could join an orchestra, which were across all of the camp networks. In Auschwitz alone, there were 9 orchestras. But I soon realized, as I began to research this, that many, many more learned people than myself with greater intelligence had written all about this. And I was feeling uncomfortable with the music they played because I didn't understand it. So then I began to think, well, my passion's rock and roll, but I've also all my life been fascinated by the Third Reich. How do I bring the two together? And so that was the contemporary reason for wanting to write.
Wow, that's fascinating. Before we go any further, do you have a 1-minute description of what the book is? I could attempt it, but I would be curious, just so that our viewers have the full context for what we're talking about. I could give it a shot, but I'd rather you give it a shot. But if you want to put the ball back in my court, I will do so.
I'll probably put it back in your court very quickly. It feels like a 1-minute thing. I remember the very first book I ever published, and it was with Picador. Is that a known publisher in
Yes.
the US?
Yeah.
And I went out very early in the process of writing with the publisher called Paul Bagley, and Paul said, "This is Daniel. He's writing a book," and the person next to him said, "And what's your book about?" And I was like, it's this and this, and Paul said, "You'll get used to this, and in time you'll be able to get it down to 2 sentences."
Yeah.
And over the years, so I've condensed this now to simply what the subtitle is, because somebody would say over the last year or so, "What are you writing?" And I'd say, "It's about pop music," and they go, "All right, and the swastika." Oh, really? And the Third Reich, oh, flipping out. What do you mean? And then they would fill in the gap. And they say, what do you mean, Joy Division? I say, well, that's part of it. And then I'll speak to another person and say, what do you mean? And then they would name the band. And then what I found, there'd be a half an hour conversation about what that person's knowledge of this subject was, where pop music, the swastika, and the Third Reich have mixed. That's my marketing pitch in 1 minute.
Great. And I will add that what Daniel has done is done extensive research into it's on a certain level, it's among other things a historical survey of presenting, where Daniel found the use of Nazi imagery, whether it's the swastika, whether it's people's Sieg Heiling, whether it's fashion modeled after not Nazi fashion, and sort of presented for us all these examples, and whether the musicians are themselves fascists or whether they are anti-fascists. And I think that that's where, in as much as there will be pushback, that's where some of it will come from. And to me, this is a great strength of the book, is that it's presented all together. And it's very powerful because we all know, some of us may think, like Daniel was just saying, Joy Division, or you may think Siouxsie Sioux or Sid Vicious. But there is so much more Nazi imagery in pop music, rock music, and punk music than I think almost anyone realizes. And Daniel has done this great service of compiling it all together into a single volume so that we can reflect on it, on the big picture question of what does this all mean? So Daniel, after all this research, this might be a tough question, but I'm sure you've been asked it 50 times in the past couple of weeks, because the UK edition of Daniel's book was published several months in advance of our US edition, which has just come out this month. What is your personal attitude towards the anti-fascist musicians that you like, whose music you like, and who you write out about in the book, who have used Nazi imagery in a satirical manner? And is your perspective, after having done all this research, is your perspective on this different than it was before you set out to write this book?
I mean, often if somebody's anti-fascist, they don't use they write about this era more positively. So I'm thinking of the Indigo Girls come to mind immediately. Amy, can't remember Amy's surname.
Amy Ray.
Amy Ray,
yeah. A friend of mine, I'm proud
to say. Is she?
Yes.
Oh, wonderful. She got a copy of the book.
Lovely person.
Have you told her she's in it?
I haven't yet, but I am sending
Johnny!
her a copy. Oh, I'm sending her a copy.
Come on. No, I mean, I was really impressed with finding out about her because she wasn't taught about the Holocaust at school.
Wow.
And then she found out bits and she was ashamed that she didn't know. So then what my understanding is, she went and self-educated herself and then wrote a song about it, which was a version of Woody Guthrie's This Train. And I just thought that was incredible. But that reveals, and this is going off point slightly, I'll come back to what you were saying, but it taps into something that's really at the heart of where this book is revolving around. And that is that to my knowledge, to this day, less than half of the states in the US teach the Holocaust. Less than half of the states. So when you consider the march that happened in Charlottesville, Jews will not replace us, the idea that potentially the majority of those people on the march have never been taught or learnt about what the Holocaust was in its broader, wider sense from a trusted person, a teacher in a safe environment at an age that would influence you. That's unbelievable. And that, the Holocaust Memorial Day, Remembrance Day, that only happened recently. That only was introduced into the States in the early 2000s, a year after it was introduced in the UK. That's almost 50 years after the event. Coupled to that, in the UK, if you were born before 1977, 78, you did not learn about the Holocaust in UK schools, unless just English schools, unless your teacher happened to have an interest and decided to do it. And that only changed in 1991, but only in England and not in Scotland, Ireland, or Wales. And when we begin to consider this broader question of why are people flirting with it, why is it acceptable, why is there not accountability, that goes a long way to answering many, many questions, I would say. So that's gone off point for what you were saying. So there's many illustrations. There's 2 chapters worth of artists that have written positively, I would say, from the dead Kennedys to Paul Weller to Indigo Girls, all the way back to Woody Guthrie and Bob Dylan, Leonard Cohen. There's lots of, and those artists haven't flirted with imagery, I don't think. But then there are other bands that say they're one thing and then have got tattoos of swastikas saying they're anti-fascist, or who am I thinking of? The rock band that did the song Angel of Death, not Slayer. Is it Slayer? Why is my mind playing up? But anyway, it'll come to me. The chorus of that song is Angel of Death, Angel of Death, Angel of Death. And that's something that thousands and thousands of people will sing back. And then all of the verses are recounting. It's Jeff Hanneman, isn't it? And they're all recounting verses of the atrocities that the Angel of Death, which is Josef Mengele, the notorious doctor who operated in Auschwitz particularly on twins, but without anesthetic on any prisoners, for multitude of unbelievable medical operations for the purpose of trying to satisfy his curiosity. Now, that song is apparently from the point of view of being anti-Nazi, but the idea of whether that translates and how it translates to an audience is a very, very, it drives a very strange line, I would argue, and which then opens out a question is how much context is needed. So for example, if Sid Vicious wore a swastika, a lot of people just say he's mucking about and he's just sticking 2 fingers up to the past generation. Yet at the same time, when he performed as the drummer with Siouxsie and the Banshees at the first punk festival at the 100 Club, he was wearing a T-shirt with the images of death camps, and he'd handwritten in the corner of his T-shirt, "I hate Jews." The book is full of contradictions, and I think it's very hard for the reader to decide perhaps where these people are on the line, on the scale.
It's hard to decide, and then it's also hard, and kind of what I'm getting at, and I'm going to want to talk a little bit more about, is it's also hard to decide what one's own personal response should be. And to that end, one quick question: when's the last time you voluntarily listened to the Sex Pistols?
Oh God, I love the Sex Pistols. I was just probably in the last couple of weeks.
So how has writing this book, researching this book, impacted your relationship as a music lover to the Sex Pistols, or has it not impacted your relationship to listening to the Sex Pistols?
I'm not advocating that anybody kicks out chucks out records or burns them. We know what happened when the Nazis started burning books in 1933. There's a road that leads to, isn't there? What I think, suggesting, and it has a lot to do with you, Johnny, because when you came over to England, when you were deciding whether to be the publisher for the US, and you read the whole book, and I hadn't written an epilogue, I'd written a travelogue, which we can talk about maybe perhaps, and what the content of that travelogue was. And you said, I need to know what you think, or I need some kind of grounding because I don't know what to think, about all of these records. And I then wrote an epilogue largely based on your the conversation we had in that pub in London. And part of, I think, I say in that epilogue is that we have to accept that this was the path. This was rock and roll. We can't change that, but rock and roll can change and go forward if there's a new kind of accountability and sense to it. But, if you are of the opinion that Michael Jackson is a paedophile, you can listen to Beat It and Thriller and not hear that in the record, but if you listen to Belson Was a Gas by the Pistols, it's unequivocal what they're saying. Never mind the fact that they're, that Belson wasn't a death camp. There was no gassing in Belson, which is another aspect of the book, which is this parallel narrative where what I wanted to do was bring references like that, terminology, imagery, and root it back in the rise of the Third Reich. And so in England, I would suggest that the majority of people would find it difficult to distinguish between a concentration camp and an extermination camp. And concentration camps did not have gas chambers. So Bergen-Belsen did not have gas chambers. As we know in the Holocaust, which is not just Jewish people, it's gays, Roma and Sinti, it's Russians, it's Slavs, it's people that the Nazis decided were physically or mentally not of the so-called superior Aryan race. But that distinction is really important. And I don't know whether John Lydon, who edited Sid Vicious lyrics, knew that or just got it wrong, because the original title was Belson Was a Gag. And, probably based on the T-Rex song. But it's interesting. But the other part of that lyric, Belson was a gas, I heard the other day, in the open graves where the Jews all lay. Life is fun, and I wish you were here. They wrote on postcards to those held dear. Now, the postcards is true. And again, I don't know if John Lydon knew this. And when I met him, I wish I'd thought to ask him. But when you were in somewhere like Theresienstadt in the what's now the Czech Republic, or you were in sent to Auschwitz from a different camp, the SS made sure that you wrote a postcard, effectively, life is fun, I wish you were here, to send back to reassure Jewish families that this was resettlement to work and prosper. The trouble was, by the time that those postcards had reached where these people had come from, those people that had written them had either been shot in the back of the neck, which was the favoured SS technique, or they'd been gassed.
Right. Wow.
Scary, this, isn't it?
Yes, yeah, it's a lot. I mean, I think, and maybe I'm going to press you a moment longer on my Sex Pistols question.
Yeah, please do.
Listening to music. Well, first of all, it's all subjective, and I mean, music and art. What it expresses is entirely subjective, or not entirely, but largely subjective, and it sounds to me like you're saying that you love the Sex Pistols, you love them from early on, and that understanding well, maybe I'll back up a second. One of the powerful things about your book is that you realize all these musicians flirting with Nazi average. This is something I took away. I'm curious if you have the same takeaway. All these musicians flirting with Nazi imagery, and there's a lot of them, as detailed in the book. A lot of them are not fascists, but the ones that aren't fascists in particular seem to think they are clever by employing provocative Nazi imagery.
You
But
know
then
what, Johnny? It's not about whether somebody's fascist or not. That's not what the book's about. It's it's about saying, why is it acceptable to reproduce an anti-Semitic symbol? Because
I
the
would,
anti
yes, and I would say that if you had an artist, a provocative artist, a smart, provocative, talented artist that used the swastika as a way to really start a conversation or rankle, and I'm not talking about it in an Indigo Girls kind of way, which is an earnest expression. But if you had someone very provocative, like say the Sex Pistols, who you employed Nazi imagery to provoke,
yeah.
but from a position in themselves, someone may or may not know it, but let's imagine they themselves harbor anti-fascist sentiments, but they're
Well,
using.
there's a great example of this, and it happened just a couple of months ago, and it was Primal Scream. They got a profile in the US, Primal Scream.
Yep.
Yeah, so they played a gig in North London, and they projected a swastika intermixed with a Star of David, a symbol of Judaism. And that made news for a day or two anyway, across all the broadsheets here, online and tabloids. And they Bobby Gillespie says he is an anti-fascist, but there were reports of Jewish people so offended they walked out of the concert, Primal Scream fans. And there was quite a reaction against that use of the imagery. There was probably a reaction for it too. But then it's about patterns of behavior. And I wrote quite a bit on Primal Scream because you can go back to 1985, and one of the first concert posters Bobby Gillespie designed for Primal Scream when he co-ran a club in Glasgow was of a Hitler Youth, was a boy from the Hitler Youth. And that was the dominant image. And that was actually reproduced in his memoir, Tenement Kid, just a few years ago. And then there's many incidents to do with that band since then through to the present day. Now, I think it's about those kinds of patterns of behavior that make it more, that becomes difficult.
So let me create a hypothetical where Primal Scream, where there's no pattern of behavior, and it's just this recent thing that you talked about melding the swastika with the Star of David, leading some Jewish members of the audience to walk out. My feeling is that and to be clear, I was raised Jewish. I'm an atheist, but I feel sensitive. I personally am very pro-Palestinian, but I am very sensitive to
Does that mean pro Hamas or pro? What do you mean pro Palestinian?
well, I don't want our conversation to lose it. I suggest we not delve too deeply in that.
Okay,
I'm just saying I
sure.
believe
Sorry.
in people's rights to live in peace. But if you and I don't want to explore whether you and I are completely in sync on this issue. I'm just saying I'm a humanitarian. I'm a
Yeah.
humanist, but I'm also a big free speech. I'm a big believer in free speech. And as a matter of fact, my father ran the American Civil Liberties Union in Washington, D.C., and fought hard, even though he was raised an Orthodox Jew. I'm an atheist now, to be clear. But my dad legally fought the fight to let Nazis have the right to march in protest on the streets of America. So I'm just saying, this is how I was raised, and this is my perspective. So I do not necessarily have a problem or an issue with Primal Scream from an anti-fascist perspective, melding the swastika with the Star of David in a way that is going to upset some Jewish people and make them leave a venue. I do not have a problem with that.
How do you know it's from an anti-fascist perspective?
I'm just saying, this is my hypothetical, so let's imagine maybe it's a different band. But one of the things that I think that your book does is points out, okay, that's very smart of you to provoke people with Nazi imagery, but guess what? There's 600 bands that have done the exact same thing before you. So you think it's very provocative to use Nazi imagery, but be original, be creative. Yes, we know Nazi imagery is very provocative and is going to upset people, but there's to me, and your UK publisher, Lee Brackstone, I had a good conversation with him, but it feels a little bit like your book exposes a certain level of stupidity that is baked into rock music and punk music. And
well, the illustration, yeah. Sorry, go on.
No,
No, I mean, the level of stupidity, for one example, is when the Dead Boys came down from Cleveland to New York and they had swastikas stamped on their equipment. And Genya Ravan, who's a Holocaust survivor, said, "I'm not recording you until you get rid of that." And they were all like, what? And they claimed they didn't have a clue what the swastika was.
Yep.
And then she then gave them a pep talk and said, not only is the person that owns this studio Jewish and letting you record here for a cut price, I'm a Holocaust survivor. And then she told them what it meant, and they removed the swastika by the time they came back. You know, there's that level of stupidity. Or you could talk about the New York Dolls just carving it into their school desk or on their school books because they claim they had no idea what it meant. And I think to a large degree, people don't know. It's like when General Eisenhower went to see the liberation of Buchenwald, and he spoke on film while he was there. And he said, you know, the American soldier says to me, why are we fighting this war? They're sure as hell will know now. And that's massive. It's massive for many of the Allied countries, particularly the UK, that we were fighting a war for a very different reason to Germany. Germany, Third Reich, was fighting a racial war. And at the beginning of the book, I quote from Hitler's Mein Kampf. And it's to say, what is the swastika? Because that's what we're talking about. And we know that the swastika is a symbol that has existed for thousands of years across many continents to many cultures, but it invariably means goodwill, peace, harmony. And then in 1919, Hitler took that image, the Hakenkreuz, and he wrote about in Mein Kampf that the red and the white represented the social idea and the nationalistic idea of the Nazi party. And the swastika was an anti-Semitic symbol. So whenever you show that symbol now, you either have to reference or put in context that it was adopted by the Nazi party, unless it's ornately decorated like it is in a lot of Eastern Asian culture. Or you have to accept that it's a stamp of anti-Semitism. So the idea you put anti-Semitism into a Star of David, it's not surprising that people found that hugely offensive, because that use of it by the Nazi party meant that 6 million people were murdered. Innocent children, women, men, in a civilized society like Germany is today. It'd be like rounding up random people off the streets of Germany now and shooting them in a dug hole, or taking them from around Europe. That's what that symbol meant. But what I'm saying is that I think that has been lost massively in popular culture, for sure. It's become something else, or represents more this idea that we're just fighting this country because they wanted to take over land, and it's lost what it means. And when we talk about people that have been murdered, I think that that's unbelievably hard to get our head around. I mean, of all people, Joseph Stalin said, you know, you can get away with killing 1 million, but if somebody gets killed in a road accident, then everybody wants to know about it. The greater the number, the greater you get away with. Well, how do you imagine 6 million people? You know, if you take Shea Stadium, how many people can get into Shea Stadium? What, 40, 50, 60,000 people? That's 2 days' work of the SS in Latvia, killing a population. That it doesn't even touch the surface of the amount of people that were killed. So when we, you know, Wembley Stadium, where I went to see Oasis the other day, you'd have to have that event 40 times over at least, with every single person receiving either a bullet or being put into a gas chamber. The numbers are unbelievable. And there's one symbol that represents all of that, and it's the swastika. But in many cases, I would say across rock and roll, I don't think that what I'm describing is probably the reason why the swastika is being used. And I think what the book is perhaps arguing is that there has to be a realignment to say, let's not forget.
Absolutely. I'm going to ask you one more question, and then I think that we can, just because of time, we can then have Peter from City Lights come back and help us and take some questions from the audience. But I just want to point out to viewers, I could continue this conversation with Daniel for the next 3 hours. I'm the publisher of this book. Daniel and I have discussed this book extensively, but I feel like we are having a brand new conversation, even though I'm this worked on the book, you know, and if any of you have book clubs, I would recommend this book highly, because there's so much to talk about. We are just scratching the surface here. And I have 15 more questions I would like to ask Daniel. And there's even some things I can tell that he's saying that, even though it's his book and Daniel knows best, that I keep want to kind of pressing about, just because of the nature of the topic and the book. And it's such a valuable contribution to music history, also to sort of world history, but speaking specifically on pop culture and music history, this book is such a valuable contribution. And you know, I should stop singing its praises because I'm the book publisher. But I think maybe people can sense from my demeanor that I'm being completely honest about how I feel here. And so, just one final question to you. It's a bit of a change of topic, but before Peter comes back on, can you talk a little bit about what you have seen, the role or lack thereof that the media has played and the music media has played, the relationship between the media and this use of Nazi imagery in music?
Well, I think what we've been discussing is we're all culpable. I'm culpable because I bought Pistols records and celebrated aspects of them wearing swastikas, and you know, and we're not just talking about the artist, because artists don't act as a silo. They act with their management, their agents, the teams around them, particularly today. You know, if you think of Kanye West and you imagine how many people are in his orbit and on payrolls, and then there's the record
all being ignored.
Perhaps so. You know, his summer single was Sieg Heil, with the chorus Sieg Heil, literally a chorus of voices. But then on top of that, the record industry, the media, everybody has played a part in either challenging or not challenging, in allowing or not allowing. And that's why there's so much kind of focus on journalism I mean, you said at the beginning of the thing, I'm not a journalist. I've never been a journalist, and but there's a focus on journalism to see what did journalists do, and certain names have come out brilliantly. Lester Bangs called this stuff out, and so did Julie Burchill in the UK, or there's various people that have challenged at different times. Other people, you know, thinking of the guy from the Eagles when he pulled out a dagger, and barely gets a couple of lines from the journalist, and then they move on, and no questioning why have you got a Nazi dagger, and it's just when it was acceptable, when it was allowed, when it was just somebody mucking about, and when it was challenged. I think that's a really fascinating and an integral part of the narrative.
Great. Thank you. All right, Peter, can you come back on and help us
Sure.
field some
We're still
audience?
waiting for a few questions to come through. It takes folks a few minutes to get the gray cells, and there's a lot to think about here. So, folks, here we go. So, Cindy says, very interesting and disturbing discussion in your book. Do you mention the origin of the name of the band Spandau Ballet? I think that has an association with the Holocaust. Also, I believe Roger Daltrey said that in the movie Tommy, the holiday camp was supposed to be a Holocaust death camp. Is that true?
Yeah, and I also found out after writing the book that Rial, the Who song, was meant to be Israel, and Townsend shortened it. There's quite a few things with Daltrey that I've actually subsequently found out and read some stuff that I want to put into the paperback and expand it. Yeah, Spandau Ballet, that's what happens. That's the dance when you were hung. When Rudolf Hess, sorry, not Hess. Hess was in a Spandau prison and the writer for the band when they first started out, Robert Elms, he saw that written, graffitied in Germany, and took the name from it. And they got into a bit of trouble because of the imagery of Journeys to Glory, their first album. The muscle bound, the kind of the Greek god kind of human, and certain terminology that was used in the inside sleeve of the album. And they were incensed at being accused of Nazism, and their response, is in the book. Mm-hmm. So yeah, absolutely right. There's a definite greater depth of analysis to the subject in the conversations I've been having your side of the pond, and across the interviews, that hasn't been so apparent in the interviews podcasts I've been doing in the UK. I can feel how troubled people are. I was in the States just a couple of years ago when I did the book tour for the two-tone book on Akashic, and that was at the point where Trump was just a few months away from his second term in office, but now that now we've gone on to the other side. It's I only know what we get from the media, and but it just feels incredibly vulnerable. I mean, particularly musicians who are fearing. I think it's about to happen that when you turn up at passport control, that all of your social media will be analysed. You have to hand over your phone, and so Christ knows what would happen if I saw all this imagery of Nazis on my social media.
Yeah. Let's see. Johnny, do you have any parting questions? I'm not seeing any more questions coming through the chat.
Hard, if you're listening and you're kind of going, oh my God, I've been hit with stuff about the Holocaust and bands, and I don't know how to frame my question. But if somebody just wants to mention a band name, just as simple as that, I could add things or not. But people, I've noticed this at events. I've done a lot of live events, and there's a kind of it's like a razor head. How do I respond? You need time to digest.
Just to throw my own name in, because he is so beloved, and I think by you as well, is can you talk a little bit about what you found with John Lennon?
Well, I mean, oh my God, I love the Beatles.
Yep.
Who doesn't? But the shocker was that John Lennon had a Nazi memorabilia collection and used to wear some of the stuff around his neck. So his first wife said, and the opening chapter is involves that private collection coming into the public domain courtesy of a neo-Nazi. That was like a mad story. So yeah, I mean, John Lennon used to, as a kid, used to draw himself ink drawings, him as the Führer. You know, Heil John, he wrote instead of Heil Hitler, and he'd be John Lennon on the podium with swastikas and golden eagles, and pictures of Hitler Youth badges. And you know, probably Beatle fans perhaps know about the antics of the band in Hamburg. Before they were signed, but yet at the premiere of A Hard Day's Night, both in Liverpool outside the town hall and when they arrived in Melbourne in Australia, John and Paul were Sieg heiling, and there's film footage where Ringo tells John off. It's amazing, you know. And then of course you go and watch Hard Day's Night, and it's littered with stuff. You remember the scene when John Lennon's in the bath and he's torpedoing the Nazis in amongst all the soap, and Ringo's Sieg heiling in the film, albeit with the wrong arm, and you know, that kind of lampooning and how to embrace, react to being born in the middle of the war with parents who were part of the war, and how is Britain going to survive, cope with, they were the enemy, but now we have to integrate. That's all wrapped into it. But yeah, there's quite a few Beatles stories, not least somebody threatening to kill Paul McCartney. That's another good one at the release of Hey Jude.
I know we're approaching kind of the end of the hour, but I have a question. Slavoj Žižek has talked in the past about bands like Rammstein, which are obviously, you know, satirical in many ways, but they'll also kind of play with imagery, although not directly related to, you know, the Nazis, but play with, you know, like a kind of a, you know, this dynamic of, you know, audience and performer power dynamic. And Zizek said that in a way they're kind of subverting the impulse, and they're kind of diffusing, you know, something culturally that might end up going in a very negative direction. Do you have any thoughts about that idea?
Well, it's a bit like Malcolm McLaren and Vivian Westwood saying we're demystifying the swastika by printing it on everything we do and selling it. I then said to myself, well, what's the definition of demystifying?
Yeah.
So to mystify, what mystery? What was the mystery? It's just it's empty rhetoric.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, you know, I don't know. Yeah, you know, you can't. Well, I don't know. You know, I mean, I don't write about this band, and that's what, ultimately one of the successes of the book I've noticed is that many people have said, why haven't you talked about Lieback? Why haven't you talked about blah, blah, blah? And to my mind, if you read the book and call out an artist, it's like, brilliant. That's what the point of the book is.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Well, Johnny, do you have any final thoughts before we wrap up?
Nothing beyond what I've already said. I think the viewers know how I feel about this book.
Yeah. Well, City Lights is very, very proud to be featuring the book and supporting it. I want to thank you both for joining us today. And Daniel, congratulations. I mean, this is a very important, very compelling book. There is so much to think about here. As we have seen, we can go on for another hour and more. This could become like a series. So yes, book clubs, folks. Think about it. This is a great idea. So this is
kind of say thank you very much for having me on. I mean, when I came to City Lights 2 years ago, it was an utter joy, and I just wish I could be there in person. So it's really wonderful to be invited to be part of this. Thank you very much.
Well, we're delighted and very, very honored to have you back. And Johnny, thank you for your generosity and your thoughtfulness in doing the honors today. Much respect. Much gratitude. You know how much we love Akashic. And thanks to all of you in the audience for joining us. I want to remind everyone we have posted links in the chat with which you may purchase books. And better yet, if you're in the hood, come on down, pay us a visit, browse our stacks. We are, of course, one of the great browsing bookstore experiences of all time. We are located in San Francisco's historic North Beach district. We're open 7 days a week from 10 a.m. to 10 p.m. Today's program has been made possible by support from the City Lights Foundation, fostering an active engagement with books and literary culture. Our mission is dedicated to sustaining a vibrant community of readers, writers, and critical thinkers. So goodbye, everyone. Take care, stay strong, be kind to each other. We hope to see you all again soon.
Bye-bye.